Welcome back, boxing fans, to another great show with Sean on Boxing. So, right now, the 154-pound division is one of the hottest divisions in boxing. But I think a lot of it still translates to what I've been saying all along back in the Charlo days. It's a strong division as far as having opponents all at the similar level, but not having any stars, not having any superstars. And this is reflected in my pound for pound list of the 154-pound division, because currently at number one I have Bud Crawford. Bud Crawford, in my mind, is easily the number one ranked fighter at 154 pounds. Obviously, he's only had one fight at that weight class, but he beat a prime, young, undefeated world champion, a guy that you will see by my pound for pound list. I rank pretty high at 154 pounds. And obviously, I've been talking about him for a long time. So, him becoming a champion and then giving Bud Crawford a very good fight only proves the things I was saying about him for, basically since he made his debut. But going into some of the bigger fights at this division, I don't think there was much question that Bud Crawford would be favored over any of them, whether you're talking about a Funduro, an Ortiz, a Tim Tszyu, who obviously is lost, Murtazaliev, a Charlo if he ever does come back, whoever, right? I can't imagine that there's anybody currently at 154 pounds somebody would rate over Bud Crawford. And that's not to say that Bud Crawford at this point of his career necessarily beats everybody, because it's a big ask to fight everyone, a lot of different style matchups. Bud's 37 years old, so it is what it is. But currently he is number one on my list. At number two, and people may think this is premature to say this, but you gotta give a brother credit for what he did, and that is Murtazaliev. Murtazaliev not only beat Tim Tszyu, but destroyed Tim Tszyu in a fashion that nobody could have expected. Even if you thought that potentially Tim Tszyu was overrated and Murtazaliev would beat him, you would never have guessed that Murtazaliev would have destroyed him in the fashion he did, especially coming off of his less than stellar performance against Jack Calquet, who I rate, and I always said Jack Calquet was a good fighter. I did pick Jack Calquet to win that fight, and I was wrong, because Murtazaliev knocked him out late, and that in itself speaks volumes, because Calquet's been a really good professional fighter who is not the kind of guy who gets knocked out. So for him to get stopped by Murtazaliev definitely tells you that Murtazaliev's power carries throughout the whole fight, because I think that was the 11th round when Murtazaliev ended up getting him out of there. And of course, we found out information after the fact that this was during Ramadan, so that could have had an effect on why Murtazaliev potentially wasn't more dominating against Jack Calquet, as well as the fight actually having in Germany, Calquet being the A-side. But I was super impressed by his performance this week. I definitely think out of everybody we rank on this list, he's probably got the most significant win, right? Really sort of standing above the competition. But to be fair, we know that these guys, most of them, are at a similar level. So you could throw him in with, a bunch of different fighters, and depending on the style matchup, he might win, he might lose. We'll have to see exactly how he develops. We know once guys become champions, they say that they improve quite a bit. So moving forward, that'll be something to keep an eye on. At number three, I have Madrimov. Madrimov is number 3 on my list as the number 3 best fighter at 154 pounds. That's one reason I feel so confident rating Bud Crawford, because I really rate Madrimov. And Madrimov against Murtazaliev, I kind of favor Madrimov based on his style, right? The fact that he is so good with his movement, and I think that would really give Murtazaliev quite a bit of problems. But it's a fight that I would be eager to watch, right, to see which of these Eastern European fighters really is the best. And we'll be talking about, obviously, quite a few more of them, because this division has some real killers from, that region of the world. As you could tell by my number 4 fighter on my list, who is, uh, I rate him here based on his victory, and that would be Virgil Ortiz. Virgil Ortiz, number 4 on my list. Obviously, Virgil struggled and didn't look very dominating in his last fight, but he was in with a really good fighter and a fighter that really sort of superseded people's expectations in his performance, and being the first real legitimate fighter that Ortiz had at 154 pounds, and not being as active as he probably should have before stepping into the fight with that kind of opponent. You can understand that, he's probably going to get better moving forward in his next few fights. But right now, when you think Crawford at number 1, Murzalia at 2, Madrimov at 3, Virgil Ortiz at 4, that's a pretty exciting top 4. At number 5, I have Sergey Boholichuk. Boholichuk obviously was the man that ended up losing a very controversial fight to Ortiz. I felt Boholichuk won the fight, but obviously he didn't win the fight, so I can't really rate him above Ortiz because Ortiz did get the decision. But Boholichuk really showed a lot. He's a little awkward, he's got good power, obviously a very good technical boxer, another Eastern European fighter that really shows that he's got a lot in his toolbox. And at that top 5, it's super impressive. Bud Crawford at the top of the pile, and then obviously 3 Eastern Europeans, and then of course Virgil Ortiz, who's always been a real highly touted up-and-coming young fighter. Right there, I mean, you throw any of those 5 fighters in against one another, and you're sure to have a fantastic fight, right? Obviously, we know we are going to get a fight between Madrimov and Boholichuk, and that should really add a lot of further information to these rankings. Obviously, the guy that wins that fight potentially could move to number 2, right behind Bud Crawford. We still have to see what Bud Crawford does moving forward. The one disappointment about Tim Tszyu losing that fight is the fact that now that's probably an opponent that's off the table. We did hear rumors that they were in negotiations to fight one another, but obviously with Tim Tszyu losing, that's very unlikely to happen at this point. So, the most likely opponent potential we could see Crawford in would be with Virgil Ortiz. So I'm hoping that is a fight that gets pushed forward, because that's a great matchup. Obviously a fight that American boxing fans would be really intrigued by. And because of the name recognition, it's obviously going to sell and do far better in the U.S. than a fight with Madrimov, Murzalia, or Boholichuk would. Obviously, these Eastern European fighters are great fighters, but they're not necessarily super marketable. And we just saw that recently with the Beterbiev Bivol fight, which, if it wasn't for the Middle East, probably never would have happened. So thank you very much, Turki Al Sheikh, for allowing that great matchup to unfold. Then we get to the bottom half of the 154-pound rankings. Some people may disagree, may feel that certain fighters should be ranked higher, and that's fine. That's your perspective. This is my list and the way I break it down. If you look at some other lists, you'll see that they're pretty similar to mine, actually. At number 6, I have Funduro. Obviously, Funduro's coming off of a big victory versus Tim Tszyu, and is scheduled to meet Errol Spence, from the way we're hearing rumors. And that's obviously a big fight that should do very well in the U.S. Errol Spence is not ranked in my top 10 on my 154-pound list, because how would he? Or how could he? This is a guy who's never fought at 154 pounds and is coming off of a brutal beatdown in his last performance, which is well over a year ago. So not only getting his ass beat, but also being out of the ring for such a long period of time, getting a new trainer, and never fighting at this weight class. It would seem a little ridiculous to actually rate him on a pound for pound list for this weight class until he actually has a fight and shows us what he really has left. So Funduro is number 6 on my list. Obviously, he is currently a unified champion. But out of everyone I've listed above him, I do think he is the weak link. He's the guy who's been knocked out before. He's a guy that's shown that he is probably the most susceptible fighter to getting beat out of the top 6 fighters that I've listed so far, and hence that's the reason he's on my list at number 6. At number 7, I have Charlo at number 7. You could say it's pretty low for Charlo, and I agree, it is low for Charlo. If Charlo had been active and actually fighting at 154 pounds, he would definitely be much higher on my list, probably number 2, maybe top 3, but no lower than that for sure. I do think, though, at this point I would have him below Bud Crawford. But he hasn't fought at 154 pounds since he fought Castano back in 2022, I think it was. So it's quite a long time ago. Obviously, he's coming off of a loss to Canelo Alvarez at 168, and so we haven't seen him bounce back from that loss yet. So we don't know mentally where he's at, and we don't know if he can still actually make the 154-pound division comfortably. So that's why he's currently number 7 on my list. Obviously, I'm not going to drop him too low because he was the undisputed unified champion. But obviously, he's currently not holding any titles, been inactive for over 2 years of this weight class, and is coming off of a loss. So, I also can't rate him too high either. But it's being talked about that he's potentially going to be fighting Abel Ramos on the undercard of one of these upcoming PBC fights. And that's a great fight and a real solid opponent for Charlo. I would be pleasantly surprised to see the PBC throw Charlo coming off of a loss and inactivity in with a guy like Ramos, because that's a dangerous fight. But if they do it, I'm down. I think that's great. It definitely gives Charlo an opportunity to definitely solidify himself as a top 2 fighter at 154 pounds if he's able to potentially beat Ramos more convincingly than Erickson Lubin did, because I thought Erickson Lubin was kind of gifted a victory in that Abel Ramos fight. So there you go, at number 7, Charlo. Then we get to number 8, and this is a fighter that I've always really liked. I've talked about him for a long time. I definitely think he deserves an opportunity, but I've been super impressed every time I watch him, and that's Charles Conwell. Charles Conwell is my number 8 ranked 154-pound fighter. I think the dude's he's old school as old school gets. Dude's tough as nails. And I'd love to see him in with any legitimate 154-pound fighter, hopefully early 2025. At number 9, and this might be too low for him, but he's been showing me a lot of inconsistency in his performance. So while I see the natural talent, he's obviously still super young at 22. I still see that, he just doesn't look like a complete package, whether that's the mental aspect or whatever it might be. Coming up as a prospect, he was getting tons of praise, but then he was in like an accident, injured himself, and since he came back, he just hasn't looked quite as explosive as he once did. And obviously he shows some issues with his gas tank, which is never a good thing, especially in a division like this where you got some killers ranked ahead of you. But Xander Zayas is number 9 on my list at 154 pounds. He definitely shows the pedigree, the skill set. The question is, can he just bring it all together and really reach his potential? And as I said, he is young. He is easily the youngest fighter on this top 10 list at 22 years old. And he does have a victory over a former champion on his resume. So obviously that's a great victory, and definitely gets him put on the list at this point. Then we get to the number 10 person on this list, and that would be Tim Tszyu. I don't want to drop Tim too far and disrespect him. Tim was doing exactly what he had to do prior to being sort of fucked over by the PBC, thrown in with a late opponent who was really a difficult opponent in Funduro, a 6'6", very long, 82-inch reach fighter, awkward with lots of sharp limbs, and the fight obviously didn't go very well. And Tim Tszyu deserves a lot of praise for even following through, because he could have easily just walked away from that card and forced the PBC to lose money and reschedule stuff, but he didn't. he stepped in, took a chance, and it backfired on him. Then he jumped in, of course, with Murtazaliev to try to win a title, which obviously would make him that much more marketable for a potential Bud Crawford unification fight. And we saw how unfortunate that went for him. But prior to that, he had a lot of really good wins. Mendoza, obviously Guasha, Harrison, and others, and Nui. So he's definitely built a solid little resume. But obviously, the question now is, how's he going to build up from here? Is he going to be able to bounce back and become a better fighter overall? And so he's still number 10 on my list. I still think he's a top 10 ranked fighter. You know, fighters have bad days, off days. Sometimes they underestimate fighters. Sometimes they don't take into consideration a person's skill set, and they end up getting exposed. And that's kind of what happened to Tim Tszyu. But I do think he's a solid fighter whose head is on the right spot. You know, he really is a real boxer who's not afraid to take real challenges. And unfortunate when you do that, sometimes you get beat. So you can understand why there's other fighters out there that do the opposite. Don't take on tough opponents and literally duck and dodge to avoid opponents that potentially could expose them or put a 1 on their loss column. So Tim Tszyu is number 10 on my 154-pound list. Obviously, you still have guys like Abel Ramos, Lubin, Errol Spence, the young Cuban kid Tellez that's coming up, and quite a few other ones as well. The young Irishman who's been fighting on UFC fights, the young French fighter who looks pretty good as well. Both of those guys are super young, 22, 23 years old. So there's a lot of youth coming up as well, and that's obviously exciting, especially for a division that's looking so good. But let me know in the comment section below, who do you got on your top 10 154 pound junior middleweight list? Does it look like mine, or do you have some differences? Thanks for watching. Leave your comments below, and I will see you next time. Peace out.